trouble with the Jews and with the Christian Jews. Verse 22, what then is to be done? They certainly hear that you have come. Paul, these Jews that have been told these lies about you, they're going to hear that you're in town, and they're going to start a riot. There's bound to be a riot, unless the people are corrected in their thinking. So they come up with a plan. 23, do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expense, so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself live in observance of the law. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment, that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from unchastity. Then Paul took the men, and the next day he purified himself with them, and went into the temple to give notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, and the offering presented for every one of them. So, in a nutshell, this is what he did. According to the law of Moses, the law given to Moses by God, costly sacrifices were required at the end of a vow. You made a vow to God, and then you had to bring a costly sacrifice to the Lord in fulfillment of that vow when it was over. Paul has been falsely accused of teaching the Jews to abandon the law that God gave Moses, saying it was wrong. This is not true. And here he proves that it's nonsense. He never said those things. He never taught those things. Because he pays for the sacrifices for these Jews who had taken a vow. And he never would have done that if he was against the law of Moses. As Paul flipped the bill to prove that the accusations were false. And sometimes God asks us to sacrifice for Him, to give up some of our so-called rights in order to help the cause of Christ. Sometimes that is necessary. 27. When the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia who had seen him in the temple stirred up all the crowd and laid hands on him. So these Jews are just going wild against Paul. One problem after another for that man. This time it was the Jews from Asia. And they had been a thorn in his flesh when he was in Asia preaching Christ. And now they show up in Jerusalem, still hounding him. 28. Crying out, men of Israel, help. This is the man who is teaching men everywhere against the people and the law in this place. Moreover, he also brought Greeks into the temple, and he has defiled this holy place. More lies. These Jews saw Paul and a Gentile friend in Jerusalem. And so they accused Paul of bringing that Gentile into the holy temple, which would have been wrong, but it wasn't true. It was their accusation which was wrong. You know, people need to be careful about making assumptions, especially about the guilt of somebody. Guilt by assumption. Just because somebody could have done something or might have done something doesn't mean that they did, and doesn't mean that they should be treated as if they did. 30. Then all the city was roused, and the people ran together, and they seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. They did not check to see if the accusations were true. They got all fired up after hearing that rhetoric, and so they acted without investigating the facts. They dragged Paul out of the temple. And God is very clear. When somebody is accused, He says in the Old Testament, make sure you investigate carefully before you condemn that person. 31. And as they were trying to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. Oh, the Romans just loved having the Jews around. Riots, trouble, here's another one. Paul's right in the middle of it. And it says, then all the city, verse 32, it says, he at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the tribune and soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Another day, another beating. Paul taught that no one will be saved by keeping the commandments. And the Jews tried to kill him for saying that. If the Roman soldiers had not stepped in, they would have killed Paul for sure. And Paul told the truth. No one will be safe by keeping the commandments. And in a world that often loves lies more than truth, that can be a dangerous thing. 33. It says, Then the tribune came up and arrested him, and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. And he inquired who he was and what he had done. The Roman commander did not know Paul. He thought Paul was a troublemaker, so he had him arrested. Verse 34, Some in the crowd shouted one thing, some another, and as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. And when he came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd, for the mob of the people followed, crying, Away with him. The commander tried to get some information from the crowd about Paul, but they were so wild that the only message he got about Paul was, We want him dead. As a result, this Roman commander and his soldiers had to literally carry Paul back to the barracks for questioning. Verse 37, As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, May I say something to you? And he said, Do you know Greek? Is it, Are you not the Egyptian then, who recently stirred up a revolt and led 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness? Paul replied, I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city. I beg you, let me speak to the people. And when he had given him leave, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people. And there was a great hush. He spoke to them in the Hebrew language. Stop there. Paul's about to speak to the rioters in their own language, Hebrew. And of course, this Roman commander didn't know what Paul had done to upset the Jews. And he will not know what Paul's about to say to these Jews either, because this commander speaks Greek, and Paul's going to speak to them in Hebrew. So he'll still be in the dark. Chapter 22, verse 1. Brethren and fathers, Paul says, hear the defense which I now make before you. Paul's asking them to hear the defense. Listen. They could not hear anything earlier because they'd been too loud and wild. So he says here, people have to calm down and slow down a little bit before they can hear the truth and learn anything. Verse 2. And when they heard that he addressed them in the Hebrew language, they were the more quiet. And he said, I'm a Jew born at Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, educated according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God as you all are this day. Paul's saying, I know where you Jews are coming from. And he did. Paul knew the mind of these zealous Christian persecuting Jews because he had been one just like them. Verse 4, he says, I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women. He's saying, you think you hate Christians? I probably hated them more than all of you. 5, as the high priest and the whole council of elders bear me witness, from them I received letters to the brethren, and I journeyed to Damascus to take those also who were there, and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. And so Paul received permission to chain Christians and bring them to Jerusalem for punishment. Now, think about it. That's the kind of guy Paul was. That's the kind of guy he used to be. What could cause Paul, who had hated Christ and Christians so much, to all of a sudden be willing to suffer so much for Christ? Answer, the risen Jesus Christ really did appear to him. And that's what he's going to talk about here in verse 6. He's on his way to get these Christians and to drag them back in chains. He says, and as I made my journey and drew near to Damascus about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone about me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. And that is why Paul the Christian killer is suddenly willing to be stoned, beaten, and whipped for Jesus Christ. You see, people can run from a lot of things, but no lost soul who hears the story of the Apostle Paul can run from the powerful witness it is to the truth of Jesus Christ. 9. Now, those who were with me saw the light, but did not hear the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Rise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do. Paul knew ahead of time what he would do for Christ and what he would suffer for Christ because Jesus told him. And Paul was willing to suffer. And I think one of the reasons he was willing to suffer is because he knew what a horrible sinner he had been. He didn't ask for great things for himself because he knew he didn't deserve it. He knew how his sinful past had caused grief to Christ. He owed Christ a debt that he could never pay. And so he would serve Christ out of love. Verse 11. And when I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me and came into Damascus. And notice how quickly Christ can handle a sinfully proud man. Paul had to be led around. Christ made him helpless. It is very smart not to talk to God. It is smart to remember that God is God, and He can humble people very quickly. And I think we'll stop right there for today, and we will pick up our study in verse 12 of chapter 22 next time. Until next time, so long everyone.